breaking news announcement. Actually, today we're just covering something that came out in kind of the news the other day. It was a paper that was published in Nature Medicine, I believe. I should know. I have it open. It was published in Nature Medicine. The article is titled "The Artificial Sweetener, Erythritol, and Cardiovascular Event Risk." So this made the headlines, and what it made the headlines for is kind of two things. One, it basically found that people who consumed high amounts of erythritol, which is an artificial sweetener, which actually isn't used that commonly anymore. I think it's been replaced. Basically, people who consume high amounts of them have an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, and there's some evidence that it increases stroke by increasing platelet aggregation. So how sticky your platelets become is really what kind of made the headlines. Now, I used to do research like this, specifically on kind of finding biomarkers that kind of predict excess risk. So I'm very familiar with these analyses. And what's interesting is I've actually done a series of experiments very similar to this, with some caveats of I haven't done all of these types of experiments, but I've done very similar ones. Like I've done do a big screen for a bunch of molecules, then run them through some basically kind of statistical analyses and see what pops out, and then take those molecules and then follow them up with animal experiments, and then follow them up with cell culture experiments. So I'm very familiar with these experiments in, some of the nuances. So today I want to talk about this. So we're going to cover kind of my synopsis. I'm going to take a very quick dive through this, but we're going to cover everything you need to know realistically about this study, and also kind of how you think about this. So the real question is, should you avoid erythritol based on this new study? So to answer that question, we really need to know, what were they trying to find out? So what the question they were really asking is, does erythritol increase the risk of major adverse cardiovascular events? And so here's what they actually did. So this means that they took an already established cohort. They looked at the levels in the blood of erythritol. We'll come back to that in kind of detail more in a minute. They found differences in the amount of it in the blood of people who experienced cardiovascular events and who didn't. And then they did a bunch of follow-up experiments. Now, there's no way that they designed all of the experiments at the outset and then did them, right? It wasn't like somebody sat down in a lab meeting and said, hey, I think erythritol might increase your risk of cardiovascular events. Here's the 6 experiments I'm going to do, and they did them in this order, right? What they really did is they found one thing and then kept doing follow-up experiments. Now, that in of itself is not really alarming. That's pretty normal. So what did they actually do? My dog's just walking into the office, so you may see little dog heads running around. So what did they actually do? Well, they did a lot of different things. So basically, here's kind of the synopsis. They did what we'll call kind of a observational study, right? And so the first thing they did was they looked at 3 cohorts of people. So they have what they call a discovery cohort. So they take a group of people. Basically, there was a clinical trial that was done for another reason. They had what we call a biobank. So they basically, whenever they do a study, they take a bunch of samples from people, they store those, and then other researchers later can come back and do their own measurements or assays, is what we'll call it. So they did this that's the discovery cohort. They found something in that discovery cohort, and then they replicated it in 2 additional cohorts, what we'll call a U.S. cohort, because it was all U.S.-based people, and a European cohort, so another group of people, but from Europe. And so what they did was they measured a whole bunch of metabolites. So it wasn't like they just measured erythritol, they measured a whole bunch. And then they kind of looked to see what popped up. Now, here's something that's important. If you look at one of the clinical trials, so you can actually look up the name of the clinical trial that they got the cohorts from, the recruitment criteria was very interesting. And here's the recruitment criteria for one of those 3 cohorts. You had to be at least 18 years old. You had to have not been previously enrolled in the gene bank registry. So you had to be a new participant. You had to give informed consent. You had to undergo cardiac catheterization or had a left heart cath at the Cleveland Clinic or at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, or at Metro Health Medical Center within a year. So they had to be, basically, they needed a cardiac catheterization, which means they're not super healthy to begin with, right? Or patients who are greater than or equal to 50 years old with normal cardiac catheterization, so less than 30% in all coronary vessels per angio. So basically that they had to have some cardiac disease, but not a lot. If you were a patient with myocardial infarction, so if you had a heart attack, if you were non-Caucasian or if you had Hispanic ethnicity, if also you were eligible if you were a patient undergoing cardiac CT, if you were going to the Heart and Vascular Institute for outpatient scheduled appointments, if you were a patient who had or were going to have an implanted cardioverter defibrillator or cardiac resynchronization defibrillator, or any patients with cardiac arrhythmias or a family history of cardiac arrhythmias. So these were not like healthy everyday adults. These were older adults who were at risk for cardiovascular events already or already had established cardiovascular disease. So these people were individuals who had an elevated risk of MACE, is what they call it, so major adverse cardiovascular events. And they were older. They were more likely to be male at baseline. They were essentially classifiable as having obesity with the median BMI of about 29 to 30. They had a pretty high prevalence of diabetes, hypertension, coronary artery disease, and heart attacks. So if we actually look at the population of people, they were between 55 and 70, 55 and 80. Their BMIs were, 25 to 30 with the median of 29. They had a 22 to 28% prevalence of diabetes. That's about double what the average in the US for adults is. I think that's maybe slightly more than average. Last I looked, it was like 9 or 11%. 72 to 80% had hypertension. 75-ish, 70 to 75% already had coronary artery disease. 17 to 19% had heart failure. About 40 to 50% had a history of myocardial infarction, heart attack. And then most of them had elevated triglycerides, so triglycerides over 100. So these are people at risk for cardiovascular disease. So what they found was that among this group of people, so this is in all three cohorts, the Discovery, the US, and the European validation cohorts, the people who consumed the highest quartile. So if you take this group of people and you break them into the lowest quarter consuming, the kind of right below the median quarter consuming, so 25 to 50 and 55 to 75, all of those people had basically the same risk. The people who consumed the very highest level of erythritol, if that's not how it's pronounced, I'm just going to butcher it this whole podcast. Those are the people that had the elevated risk. And that risk was, fairly high. I think the increased risk was about threefold. It kind of varied based on a whole bunch of stuff, but let's just call it an average of 2.5 to threefold higher risk. So your hazard ratio, your risk, was about 2.5 to 3 times higher. Now, before we move on, there's something very important to actually look at. And if you look at the supplemental tables, so if you look at the tables of the kind of the demographics of the Discovery cohort, the US cohort, and the European cohort, there's something very interesting to note. If you compare the highest quartile to the lowest quartile, so the people who consumed the most erythritol compared with the lowest erythritol, they were about 10 years older in the Discovery cohort. They had a higher BMI. Their prevalence of diabetes was almost threefold. So the lowest quartile had about 14.8%, and the highest quartile had 37%. They had about 50% higher rates of heart failure. They had, and they also had higher triglycerides. And if we look at the US validation cohort and the European cohort, we basically see the same thing. They were in the US validation cohort, they're about 13 years older. they had 3 times higher prevalence of diabetes. They had about 50% higher, about 40% higher rates of coronary artery disease. So 85% of the people in quartile 4 had already had established coronary artery disease. They had a almost 2.5 times higher prevalence of heart failure. They had almost double the rate of history of myocardial infarction. They had substantially higher triglycerides, lower HDLs. So their risk profile, just from like a cumulative metabolic perspective, was substantially higher. Now, the same thing basically shows up in the European cohort. I won't go through it all because it's basically identical, except for they had even higher rates of diabetes in that group. So what this tells me is there's a little bit of what I always call the kind of cluster phenomenon of like, it's very rare that you find somebody who is young, fit, healthy, drinks a ton, smokes a ton, and has terrible blood glucose, right? It's also very rare that you find somebody who's older, very overweight, has a very unhealthy dietary pattern, and has perfect, blood chemistries, right? Their cardiovascular disease is low. So you kind of see these clusters. Now, people will try to statistically adjust for these. So when you kind of run the statistical models, you'll often see a lot of these like adjustments being made. But the math says it should work, but I don't think that's actually the case because I've done so many of these studies and I used to spend months of my life in a given year just adjusting these models. Like I've spent time doing this, so I kind of know how this works. So that's what they found in the observational study. Now, this doesn't tell us anything about mechanism or causation, but it does tell us that, hey, if you are in the higher risk of people, you're older, you have higher risk of diabetes, etc., you're also consuming more erythritol. So we can't really take causation. Now, there was some additional interesting stuff. So they did what we call an ex vivo. So they took stuff out of the body and then ran some additional tests. So they took what's called platelet-rich plasma, and they incubated it directly with erythritol, and they found that it kind of increased platelet aggregation. So if you take human blood that's enriched for platelets, well, they took plasma, not blood, but you put erythritol directly in it, it makes platelets more sticky. Now, they also did this with healthy volunteers, so people who weren't already sick. They took their blood, and they found the same thing. So apparently, incubating blood directly with erythritol makes them stickier. How that translates to like actually in vivo in humans, really hard to tell. So the next thing they did was they did what we call a microfluidic study. So you can actually kind of engineer these, like, you can basically engineer fake capillaries and vessels, and you can push blood through them. And then you can kind of measure things, and you can kind of simulate kind of vasculature. And basically they found that erythritol makes clotting in a collagen-dependent manner easier, right? A lot of times collagen is involved in clotting, especially kind of around microvascular kind of trauma. So erythritol made clotting easier. Now, they also did a mouse study where they basically induced arterial injuries. I didn't spend a ton of time looking into the exact model. So there's a lot of ways to induce kind of vascular injury in animals. You can do it, I think they use like iron oxide, or they use some sort of like iron-based, I'll call it irritant, to basically cause vascular damage. You can do pressure overload. You can do a whole bunch of things to mice to kind of simulate arterial injuries. And they found that giving mice erythritol increased clotting formation. Now, I don't know a ton about that mouse model, if that really, replicates human disease. I don't really know how that dose in mice translates to humans. So we don't know the translatability. But it is interesting that in vivo, when there's high amounts of erythritol present in the blood, it does affect clotting, and it makes clotting more likely, right? Clots increase risk for stroke. Now, another experiment they did was they gave people 30 grams of erythritol in one sitting. Now that's about 7.5 teaspoons, which feels like a lot. Like that would be, I think that's probably about, 6 to 8 cans of a erythritol sweetened soda. I could be wrong. It could be fewer. It could be like 3 to 4. It's really hard to find dosing of this stuff in commercially available drinks, but I think that's about right. I don't know for sure, but I think that's about right. So if anybody has any more insights, maybe it's 2 cans, maybe it's 4 cans, but I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 8. And what was the most interesting thing to me about this study is the following. If you consume 30 grams of erythritol, you substantially increase the blood levels of it. That makes sense, right? You consume it, it shows up in the blood. And when you drink that much, the levels go up to an amount where you see corollary data in like cell culture models that platelets can become stickier. So there may be an acute issue with this. Now, what's most interesting is it took about a day and a half to 2 full days after consuming 30 grams in one sitting for the levels to come back down to baseline, basically. So this tells me it takes a while for your body to process this stuff, which is interesting. I don't know what that means for chronic consumption. There haven't been a lot of studies on this stuff in terms of like, if you consume 6 a day, what are the levels? We don't really know a lot. If you consume 2 a day, we don't know if there's kind of this chronic buildup. So we don't know if having 2 a day for 4 days is the same effect as having, 8 in one day. Like I just don't know the information to that. But we don't have any good human data to show if you consume a couple in a day, does it acutely affect your actual clotting? There's a lot of corollary stuff here, but there's not any clear data. At least I did a quick search. I didn't find anything. Maybe somebody has some other data, but I don't know. So there is some other important information in that there's a lot to unpack here that isn't necessarily mentioned in the article itself. So kind of here's some of my thoughts. Why they focus specifically on erythritol and not some of the other molecules is a bit weird to me, and it makes me think that what they did was they did these what we'll call high throughput studies. So you could basically design a bunch of experiments in culture or in dishes, and you can run a whole bunch of different molecules through them, and then you can run them through a bunch of machines, and they'll give you the output for like all these different experiments at once. And then they just found what was interesting, and then they did follow-up experiments. And one of the reasons I think this happened is if you go to the paper and you look at, extended data figure 1, which I will scroll down to because I'm highly prepared, there's a lot of other molecules that basically have the same results as erythritol. Like if I in my head just say, hey, anything that's statistically significant and occurs in the same order of direction, probably could have looked at. Like we see erythritol, isothreonic acid, threotol, myo-inositol, xylose, cellobiose, mannose, levoglucosane, saccharic acid, lactulose, xylitol, glycerol. Now, there's sucrose in here too. But what's interesting is those are all basically either sweeteners, commercial ingredients, and or byproducts of metabolism. So some of these things like saccharic acid and glycerol can just be natural byproducts of human metabolism, and those are generally things that are increased in people who have kind of what I just labeled disordered metabolism. So it could just be that these people who have the highest intake of erythritol are consuming that because they shouldn't be consuming sugar because they have diabetes, right? So it could just be they are already not in a great place metabolically, so they have to consume things that aren't sugar. So this is definitely it could be a series or a situation, of kind of reverse causation. So this kind of makes me think that the increased erythritol is not hyper-specific and is probably a more generic marker of kind of overall diet and metabolic function of these people, which kind of bears itself out in those supplemental tables. So the flip side of that is the follow-up experiments in the animals, the microfluidics, the kind of ex vivo blood studies, the human metabolism study to show like values, they provide some credence that this specific one, erythritol, might be worth doing more investigating, but it doesn't bode super well to me that the panel was not hyper specific. So, again, my thoughts are interesting finding, not super damning evidence. So here's my TLDR. So if you've listened all the way, I should have done this at the beginning, but I like to just draw you in. So here's my kind of too long, didn't read, or I wasn't paying attention, zoned out on my drive to work, and now I need to pay attention because I just showed up to the office and I got to get the last 30 seconds. Consuming large amounts of erythritol may carry an increased risk of thrombotic events, strokes, clots, etc., among people who are already at risk for major cardiovascular events. It appears that it requires relatively large amounts, probably in the neighborhood of 4+ drinks a day. However, that amount is in line with what some people consume. The human data is a bit shaky and hard to interpret, and the animal data is a bit weird to really piece together, but in totality, there's some evidence in here that suggests that higher levels of erythritol in the blood may affect platelet function that increase the risk for thrombosis. It may be advisable to limit these types of beverages, and these meaning erythritol-containing beverages, to less than 2 per day, especially if you have an already increased risk, meaning you're over the age of 70, or you're over the age of like 65, you have diabetes, you have a history of myocardial infarction, heart attack, coronary artery disease, congestive heart failure, etc. You should probably consider limiting those, just because it's a little unclear. The data is not entirely clear, and there are a lot of unanswered questions, and we can't really draw strong conclusions. If you're an otherwise healthy individual, we have no real data to know if it carries any risk, and any reasonable consumable dose, we can't say much in healthy people. Now, there are alternative sweeteners that may be worth considering switching to a different one with a different safety profile if you feel more comfortable. So that's it. That's my take on that study. The breaking news session is over. I will let you return to your Netflix marathon of whatever you guys are watching. Anyway, that's it. That's the podcast. I'm Dr. Brad. I'm out of here.